think you all know me. My name is Werner Bonitz. Of course, you can tell I'm from Germany, and if you don't understand some of my German pronunciation of words, my wife can translate for you. So, there she is. You are hardy souls to come out here tonight. And then there's also the bad weather that you have to do. So, anyway. And tonight we're going to have two sections. The first section will be about light and color, and the second section will be about how we deal with it with our cameras. So don't get discouraged through the first section if you don't like it. You know, there's something else.
Is there going to be a midterm exam, Werner?
I just want to say there's no snoozing or dropping off. You will be tested at the end, so you'll be shown up. What else? If you have questions during the presentation, raise your hand. I have a spotter. He will tell me when you raise your hand because I might be busy. And ask your question. Because keeping it till the end, you may forget about it or not remember it or it wouldn't fit in or whatever. If it gets too much, then we may have to defer it to the end. But anyway, don't worry about interrupting or doing something else. So, light. We usually take it for granted, except if there's a power outage. That's a problem. But without light, there would not be any advanced life on this earth. There wouldn't be any photosynthesis, there wouldn't be any green plants, we wouldn't be here, or we would look very different than we do. So light is very important, but most people, well, it's just there. So what is light? Let's see if I can do that. The answer is usually it's an energy wave. And waves are a disruption in a medium. So like here in the water, the ducks create this disruption, disturbance, and you see waves going out. Now the waves have all kinds of sizes. You have very tight little ones up here, you have long ones back there, and so on. So it depends what kind of disturbance and how much of it, and so on. But energy waves work pretty much the same way. And the way we identify waves in general and energy waves is by the distance from one wave cap to the next. And that in energy waves, because they are usually very small, is measured in nanometers. Nanometers are 1/1,000,000th of a meter, and anyway, that's very small. But the longest ones are longer than a football field. Some waves, they just go through everywhere. So, this is a picture of the energy spectrum. Overall, you have the smallest, oops, wrong button. I have to get used to this. You have the, no. You have the smallest waves over here, and then they get longer and longer, longer. This cuts off at 100 meters, but they really get much longer than that. And in here, a tiny little sliver, we have what we call visible light waves. And that's all we can see. Or rather, we can't see the light waves. Because if you look, there are light waves coming down from the light to the floor, but you don't see them. Only if they hit something and reflect back and hit your eyes directly, go inside, can you actually see the light. So what we can see is a range from about 400 nanometers to 800 nanometers. And you see different numbers there. I mean, it's all, they ask people what they can see and what they can't see. Different people can see different things and so on. So it's a little bit this way, a little bit that way, and so on. We have infrared on one side here, and some vision goes into that. not so much into ultraviolet, but infrared certainly we can see some of it. So there's a difference between 400 nanometer and 800 nanometers is 400 nanometers. So how much is that? An inch, you can tell what that is. But 400 nanometers? Well, this paper is about 100,000 nanometers thick. So 400 nanometers is about 1/250th of the thickness of this paper. That's all we can see. And that's our whole range of vision, all our rainbows. Everything is contained within that narrow range. It's amazing. It really is that we can distinguish anything at all. Okay, we got through that. I just don't want to lose anything. Energy waves, like regular waves, usually travel in straight form. But they can bend. They can bend around edges. And that's a problem. Well, first let's talk about the waves themselves. The waves we saw in the pond are the top waves. They just go up and down, up and down, up and down. Energy waves go all different ways from their center. And that's important later on when we talk about polarizers and how they work. Because polarizers can't work with straight waves, they can only work with this kind of unruly wave. Cool. And we simplify that for later on, just symbols basically. Up there is an energy wave, and we pare that down even more. So when we talk later on about polarizers, that's the kind of symbol you will see representing an energy wave. That's a rim light. That's when light comes in from the back of something and bends around the edges. You don't see the light itself, but around the edges you just see it bending in a little bit. And you can do some nice stuff with that in photography. And it's a problem in cameras because if you have a very small opening, I'm sure you have heard that your picture won't be quite as sharp with a very small opening. And that's the problem, because the waves bend around the edges of that small opening and they bump into each other, and that confuses your picture. Okay, so how do we see? There are four kinds of cones in our, or four kinds of receptors, I should say, in our eyes. One can just detect light, period, any kind of light. The other three each detects a different kind of wavelength and separates it out. And we usually say they are red, green, and blue, but that's not quite true. Yes, they are mostly red, green, and blue. In this case, long waves, medium waves, and short waves. But see how much they overlap. The long wave, which represents red, and the medium wave, which represents green, are almost one and the same. Very little difference. Blue is a little bit an outlier there. So that's how it looks when we paint it in with the colors. We perceive the longest wavelength as red, the medium wavelength as green, yellow, and the shortest wavelength as blue. Now remember, it's just 400 nanometers from one side to the other. So it's a tiny space. The blue is kind of separate. The other two merge together. And I think blue was evolutionary change that happened recently, in terms of millions of years. Because a lot of old people didn't have a name for blue. The old Greeks didn't have a name for blue. Imagine, green.
Huh.
Blue sky, blue water, everything. They didn't have a name for blue. The Irish didn't have a name for blue. And some other folks too. So it's a strange thing, but our main vision is really in the green, yellow area there. And I think it's, again, evolutionary. You have a question?
Are you saying they didn't see blue?
Who knows?
Ancient line?
Who knows? I think they did see blue, but didn't have a need for a name for it. Some primitive tribes in Amazon jungle and so on don't have any color names. They just refer to it, oh, that's a banana, or that's whatever. Orange, the name orange didn't show up in Britain until they started importing oranges from their colonies.
Hmm.
So, we'll get back to that. It's an interesting thing. But anyway, if we combine all that in an overall view, that's about how we see. And it doesn't mean that we see everything yellow-green. It just means that we see more detail in the yellow-green areas. So if we look at a meadow or a forest or we see a lot of detail in that. If we look at something red or something blue, not so much. Yeah, we see a few differences, but not that kind of detail as we see in the green-yellow area. And we see that replicated again in our cameras. We come to that, where they mimic that kind of vision, where green is the main color for detail. Okay, color of light. I said light can be bent. That's another way of bending light, through a prism. Prism separates the colors, and the different wavelengths bend in different degrees. So they separate out. That's how we can see a rainbow. Rainbow is this kind of breakup in tiny little water drops in the air. And you know it's usually right after rain, in a certain direction only, and so on. But that's what happens there. So, of course, if we can break up a color, a light per se, and we usually refer to that light as white light. I prefer a neutral light, but anyway, that's where all the other lights are contained in it, all the other wavelengths are within that white light, but this shows us that they are really there. So, if we can go one way, we can go another way. We can combine the colors again. Take red, blue, green, red, green, blue, and combine them, and they end up with white light. Well, again, I don't like the name white light because it's only white if you have a lot of light. If you have less light, tone it down, and that becomes gray. It's still neutral, but not white. But white is convenient, so we talk about that. We talk about white balance in the cameras, and that's the same thing. We're not really just balancing the white, we're balancing all the colors. But white is the most convenient thing to look at, the most obvious thing to look at. So we define the colors of the light with not degrees Kelvin, don't say degrees, just Kelvin. You say degree centigrade, degree Fahrenheit, you do not say degree Kelvin, just Kelvin. Those are little things that you can be proud of to know. You know, you can correct somebody and feel good about it and so on. So again, now what's happening here is the color temperature came from, somebody looked at metal being heated. And when you heat it at low temperatures, it starts glowing deep red. and then it gets brighter and whiter and then bluish. So that's how they arrived at this relationship. You have red at a very low temperature, and then going through higher temperatures up to very high temperatures for the blue. Now that's opposite how we feel about colors, because low temperature means cold, right?
Right.
But low temperatures are the warm colors here. Warm colors, we feel like red, you know, heat and so on, all that. But here, high temperatures mean blue. So that's just an oddity that came about. And there's a lot of that going on, the difference between scientific explanations of how things work and how we feel about them. So that's where photography comes in too, you know, you need to address that. Okay, here we go to a different kind of display of color temperatures, basically. And this is a daylight, and it's just mapped again from the low nanometers here, low wavelength, blue through yellow to red, and the blacks at the ends are still contained in daylight, but we can't see them. That's the infrared on this side and the ultraviolet on that side. They are contained in the light, but we can't see them. So this is a more accurate depiction of color in light than just saying Kelvin. Because a Kelvin number, yeah, it says something, but it doesn't tell you exactly what's in it. I have this little display over here, you know, different colors on the different lights. And if you look at them, how different they look under the different lights. One is incandescent light, one is daylight, and on top you have the light from the ceiling on it. And they're entirely different. So that would reflect in a graph like this. But it would not reflect necessarily in just a Kelvin number. But Kelvin is convenient, you know, that's what we deal with. These are different other light sources. The craziest is the fluorescent lights. They come in all kinds of things, but they have these spikes that emphasize one specific color, you know, and so on, so things look weird, don't they? Usually the green, you know, they're greenish in color. You have the daylight, and then this is incandescent light, the good old house bulbs, you know, they are high in red but low in blue. And so all kinds of different light, halogens are a little bit better. And then the newest light is LEDs. And the LEDs, you can tell immediately when you look at one of these, because they have the main pump here, the main light is here, but then they have a little blue thing here. And depending if you have cool white or warm white LEDs, you know, you can get all kinds of different. That hump will be bigger or smaller in here. But you see something like that, it's an LED light immediately. Because there are so many things, we are used mostly to daylight. We see most things on the daylight that is normal for us. So we want daylight as our standard. But which daylight? It changes from morning to noon to evening. You know, it's totally different in our times. Weather changes it, and so on. So we need a standard, what we call daylight, our standard light. And the International Commission for Illumination has established 6500 Kelvin as the standard daylight color. Now Americans have to be a little bit different always. So the American graphics industry has decided they are going to use 5000 Kelvin. So that's the difference here. On top you have 5000K, and this is 6500K, the international standard. And you can see that this is a little bit more blue. It goes higher up in the blue area here. This goes more over the whole area across, except the blue. So they're a little bit different. But if you send your prints to somebody to match another print that you have, they will look at it on the D5000, on the 5000K. But all your computers, your cameras, the projectors, everything is usually on 6500K, international standard. So there is a discrepancy there. And, but unless, like I said, you get your things printed somewhere and somebody matches it to something, it doesn't really matter all that much. I had this picture in the print competition. And if any of you were sitting up front and could see the picture in the light box and on the projector, you could see how different they looked. And I kind of mocked that up. The light box is at 4000K. The projector is at 6500K. So 6500K is much bluer. It emphasizes the blue and brings that out, while this emphasizes the red area a little bit, or the medium yellow areas. So the two pictures look very different, one or the other. Now, I haven't talked to people yet about that, but our light box is out of sync. 4000K is not a standard for anything. Funny enough, I built that light box like 20 years ago. And at that time, I followed the instructions from, what's the National Photography Association here? I forget what it is. Anyway, they put out the pamphlet, and this is what a light box should be like, and that's how I built it. If I would build it today, and I might offer to change that, I would probably bring it up to 5000K or even 65.
Well, we'll take you up on that one. Yeah,
So,
sure.
but yeah, it makes a difference how you see a picture.
Yeah.
Now, if I had put a red picture in, I would have been much better off in the light box, because that's what that would emphasize. 4000K, lower temperature, more reddish. That's a picture I got off the internet, and it shows that you can't see a color if it's not in the light. Things don't have color. This is not brown. This is not orange. It's just reflected light that our eyes pick up. So if a color isn't in the light, you won't see it in the picture either. Here, there's a shadow across the bottom here in the top, which screens out the sun, the direct sunlight. And the oranges in the center look much redder, much more lively than the ones in the shade. And even if I lighten the ones in the shade, they still look duller. You can't resurrect color if it's not in the light itself to start off with. Now there are some tricks you can work around it, but it will never be exactly the same. Okay, again we need standards. We talk about color, and everybody sees color differently. What our eyes see actually is not color at all. They just receive the wavelength, they register it, they convert it to a small electric current, send it onto the brain. In the brain says, oh, I know that, that's blue. And that's what we think we see. And how does the brain associate blue with that particular color? Well, we learned it from our mothers. Look at that blue sky. Really, literally. We learn the words for the colors, just like we learn any other words, except I have no idea what it really looks like in your brain. I have an idea about what I think I'm seeing, but I can't express it. I can just say, well, that's blue. But my blue is different than your blue, or your blue, no. So it's a totally virtual world that we live in, and see color, or things per se, probably too. And so anyway, with all these things, we need some way to describe a color. What is a color? So we have color models and we have color spaces. Color spaces are the limitations of gadgets in reproducing color. Like your iPhone, when you look at it, at the picture, there are only a limited number of colors in that. And that's its own gamut or color space, a color model, color space. I get confused too. And so color spaces are the limitations of specific things. A printer has a different limitation in printing colors than projector has, and so on. So each thing has their own limitation, their own gamut or color space. But we need a standard. We can't just say, oh yeah, that's so-and-so, whatever. So there are color models, how we look at color, how we describe it, and color spaces, the limitation of colors of specific items. Look, what happened? Yeah, right. Okay, RGB is a color model. It's not a color space. RGB is just how we look at it. We look at it as blue, green, red, mixing them up, and that's how we describe it, color. sRGB and Adobe RGB are color spaces. They describe limitations of specific things or gadgets that produce color. The big thing around there is what our eye can see. The next lines inside that is Adobe RGB. And the smallest triangle in there is sRGB. sRGB, by the way, it doesn't stand for small RGB, it stands for standard RGB. But sRGB goes in virtually every device that we use can reproduce that. So if you send out on the internet a picture, you want to put it into sRGB because you don't know what the recipients will look at it with. So sRGB, you can be sure the colors will look right on their gadget, whatever they use. If I use Adobe RGB and send it out, not so much. An iPhone can't reproduce that. Only some very high-end monitors can reproduce Adobe RGB. So those are standard limitations that fit within a range of gadgets that we use. Usually, for all our things, submissions to the club and so on, we use sRGB because the projector doesn't handle anymore. If somebody looks at it at their computer or at home or whatever, they can handle sRGB, the colors will look right. But if we send a bigger space out and their gadget kind of scrunches it out, then all kinds of things can happen. colors don't come out right and they look wrong and so on, because it has to somehow compress the whole thing. This is another color model and color space. LAB is something that unfortunately only Photoshop supports. You know, when you go into image modes and so on, you can find it in Photoshop along with RGB and black and white and all kinds of other modes. I like it a lot because what it does is separating lightness, luminosity from the colors. When you correct something in RGB on your computer, you take a little bit of red out. You're not only taking red out, you're also making it darker, because that amount of light is now missing. So it's all intertwined. You change one thing and you change all the other things too. Here, you change a color, it doesn't touch the lightness. Because of the way it's constructed, it looks at it differently and splits it up differently. So we have from black on the bottom to white on top, that's lightness, luminosity. We have from the inside out to the outside, we have from gray, neutral, to very saturated on the outside. And that, by the way, mimics that little color tree here. When you look at that, you have color around the outside, you have light from the bottom up, and you have saturation from the inside out. But this works on the computer. This one doesn't. This one works only with paint. So I like it, and I do a lot of adjustments in LAB space because it allows me to adjust specific things that I can't do in RGB, because I'm not mushing up everything together.
But it's still in the RGB space, so you can get a copy of what you did?
No.
So
What you have to do is you go out of RGB, you transfer it to LAB. You work in LAB, and then you have to convert it back into RGB to do anything else with it. Your printer won't accept LAB. Nothing else will accept LAB.
That's what I thought.
So you have to convert it back. And the problem with that is that it can't convert layers. So if you have built up layers in LAB, you know, which you of course do, then you have to flatten the whole thing before you can transfer it back to RGB. So I usually save a copy of that LAB file in case I want to go back to it, and then I collapse it and I convert it back to RGB and go over to that. Yeah, that's a problem, you know, you can't use it for anything else. It's a mathematical color space. And by the way, it's a huge color space. It's so big that it contains colors that don't exist actually. So you can go really wild in adjusting your colors. Yes, it will tone it down somewhat, but still you get the maximum contrast that you can get in color there. A term that often comes up, bit depth. You hear it with your camera. You know, when you save a file, it gives you a certain bit depth. Modern cameras can get up to like 16 bits depth. In most cases, you're limited to 8 bits. And this is what it means. Bits is the smallest piece in a digital file. It's really a 1, 0, yes, no. You know, that's how digital files are built up. And a bit is one of those numbers, sequences. So the more of those number sequences you have built into each pixel, the more information you have in there. If you have only 8 bits in each pixel, you get an appearance like that up there. See, the transitions within the colors are not very gradual. They're kind of chopped off across. And the more bits you have in each pixel, the smoother it gets, you know, and gradually you get to the bottom here and so on. So if you want to have a really high-grade image file, then you have to go to a higher bit depth, and that doesn't work with JPEG. JPEG only works in 8 bits. You have to go to a TIFF file or Adobe file or something else that are common things. Okay, that's what this is, the color wheel. Painters use that. They look at it that way. And the strange thing with that is this is built on actually testing people, you know, and seeing how they respond to color and so on. And they came up with the biggest contrast colors, the opposite colors, are blue and yellow and red and green. Now, from what we have seen before on the diagram from 400 nanometers to 800 nanometers, you would think that blue and red would be the most contrasting color that you can have. But in reality, our brains don't work that way. So if you want a real contrasty picture, red and green, blue and yellow. If you use neighboring colors, then it gets mellow, you know, it's good too for different purpose. I don't know if any of you were here last year when Jeff Miller was critiquing 1 month, and he constantly said, oh yes, red and green, I love it. That was his color scheme, you know. But anyway. So opposing colors visually create the most contrast. And contrast in pictures really is a stand-in for movement. You know, pictures stand still. They have no movement in them. But contrast gives you those jumps in there. You know, your eye jumps around, and it's like moving around. You move your eyes around the picture instead of the picture moving, but it still stands in for movement. That's one page from this little thing here. And it shows you that a color space is not a round sphere. Not all colors behave the same way. The blue, again from the center neutral to most saturated on the outside, does best, has most diversity in the center range. Not too light, not too dark. The yellow, you can't get a very saturated yellow that is dark. It only happens when it's very light. Then you can saturate it and you can get a lot of variation into it. So a color space doesn't handle all colors the same way. It's specific to colors. Each one has its own space, so to speak, within the bigger space. Okay, how are we doing time-wise? Let's have a short break.